My name is Patrick Allett, and I'm a teacher. I teach outstanding undergraduates at Emory University in Atlanta. But I've also taught French and English in a Scottish prep school. I've coached my daughter's soccer team, the Tornadoes. I've taught students how to draw in Oxford, England. And I've taught all sorts of historical subjects to groups of American senior citizens. If you've seen me before, it's probably because I've been making courses with the teaching company for the last few years, 6 of them in all, whose studios, very, very different from a classroom, required me to develop a whole new range of teaching skills. Teaching's a wonderful way of life. You're always giving students, whatever their age, something new and something interesting that will help them either directly in their work or indirectly as you introduce them to the riches of our civilization. I've been very fortunate in having an almost unbroken teaching career since my early 20s. I've always enjoyed the challenges it brings, and I've been learning steadily about how to try to do it better for 30 years now. Now, I don't want to imply that being a teacher is all roses. Students often don't want to do the necessary hard work that you assign them, or they don't want to join in class discussion, or they hand in their work late or not at all, or they resent the grades that I give them. It's possible to deal with all the friction that teaching creates, but it usually takes plenty of experiences as you build up an awareness of what's going to happen and how to deal with it. The teaching company asked me to make a course with them about the art of teaching, and I was very, very pleased and honoured to accept. Now, what is it that brought us together, especially since I'm a foreigner? Well, they knew I was an enthusiastic teacher. I've been inspired by great teachers throughout my life, starting out quite early, very early. My own father was a high school physics teacher, and he gave me a high sense of a teacher's need for self-control, self-improvement, and hard work. He was also a World War II veteran, a veteran of the Royal Air Force. And as a kid, I just couldn't get enough of his stories about his life in the military. To me, it seemed wildly adventurous and exciting. And I think one of the reasons I became a historian was because of the stories he told me about the war. All the kids in my generation were the children of, or nearly all were the children of veterans. And so it was that, plus his teaching, which encouraged me to become a teacher as well. When I was in high school, I had a wonderful history teacher called Mr. Ivan Way. And he was the first person who really made me feel the contingency of history. The fact that just because things did turn out a certain way didn't mean that they were bound to turn out that way. And suddenly got me back into the feeling that if you were living in 1910 or 1920 or 1961, things really could have gone in different ways. He was very, very good at conveying to students, me among them, the idea that the links between the past and the present are powerful and real. He came from County Durham in the northeast of England, a coal mining district, which for decades had suffered from very, very acute poverty. And he brought home to me the reality of the kind of suffering which generations of mining families had to endure, working underground, suffering from lung diseases, periodically perishing in mining cave-ins. I really started to feel the intensity of history, not just as it related to great events like the wars and the doings of the kings and queens, but also the history of ordinary people in ordinary work, struggling with everyday problems. So his teaching was very emotionally powerful and had a lasting effect on me. I'm still in touch with him today, and I honour him very much for the effects of his teaching. I went to college at Oxford University. I was a student at Hertford College, Oxford, in the mid-1970s. And there I was introduced to the rigours of the tutorial system. This is a very gruelling form of one-on-one teaching, which is designed to turn callow schoolboys into intellectually self-confident adults. Now, here's how the system works. The student every week is told to write a paper, to research it widely, write the paper, and then go along to meet the professor one-on-one. And the tutorial is an hour long, and it begins with the student reading aloud the paper he or she has just written. Straight away there, the fact that you've got to read your paper aloud to the teacher means you're probably going to work harder on it because you don't want to sound weak, and you certainly don't want to sound ridiculous. Now, in those days, still in the 70s, the teachers weren't especially interested in the students' self-esteem. If the tutor thought your paper was bad, he'd say so with blunt directness. And I remember some squirming tutorials, especially in the early days, when I clearly hadn't done enough work, or I hadn't thought carefully enough about what needed to be done, and I hadn't understood necessary connections. Gradually, I started to realize that the teacher's toughness was a response to their perception that I and my fellows were capable of doing work of this kind, but that we had to be goaded into doing it, if necessary, by frank criticism. I learned an enormous amount from the tutorial system, both as a student, how to be a more effective student, but also I was watching the teachers and realizing, look at the effectiveness of the way in which they're imposing high standards on me to enable me to live up to them. From Oxford, I went on a vacation to America and then came back to America the following year, 1978, where I enrolled as a graduate student at the University of California in Berkeley. And there I was part of a generation of aspiring American historians learning at Cal, a beautiful and magnificent place. Now there, really for the first time, I learned about seminar teaching. The teaching at Oxford had nearly all been one-on-one, which certainly has its strengths, but also does have limitations. By contrast, at Berkeley, the normal thing was to be in a seminar of about 10 or 12 or 15. We all did the same readings, and then we came to discuss them with the oversight of the professor. And again, straight away, I was introduced to the profound seriousness of this work and the recognition that it could be done very, very intensively indeed. There's a wonderful esprit de corps among my generation at Berkeley. Very often we'd meet the night before to go over the main issues in the reading so that when it came to discussing them in front of the professor, we could put on a good show. That was my first introduction to seminars, and I've remained convinced ever since that they're a superb way of learning because they expose the students to each other's insights and then offer the additional help of the teacher's guidance as well. And from that time, almost from then up to the present, I've been teaching seminars. Also at Berkeley, I became a teacher for the first time. With no training at all, I took on 2 groups of 20 high-spirited young Californians. The way it worked at Berkeley, and the way it worked at most graduate schools in those days, and to a large extent still does today, is that there's no formal training. You're simply told, now it's your turn to teach. The presumption seems to be, if you understand the material, surely you're going to be able to convey it to the students. Now, of course, the reality is that that's not true, but certainly that's the expectation that was laid on us. And I and all my colleagues had to fumble our way to an effective way of classroom teaching. And the poor old undergraduates with whom we were, on whom we were practicing had to put up with the early mistakes we made. And I made all the mistakes. Over the course of the next 23 lectures, I'll be telling you about many of the things not to do in the classroom. And please be reassured that I did all of them and know from personal experience the way in which mistakes in teaching are painful for the students and painful for you, the teacher, as well. The trick is always to learn from them. After graduate school, after I'd finished writing a doctoral dissertation, itself a terrible struggle, I became a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard Divinity School. I was a specialist in American religious history. Then in 1988, I got a job at Emory University, and I've been working there ever since. Emory's a lovely place to work, and I've had the good fortune of being there while the university has been improving. From year to year, it becomes more selective. It becomes more difficult for high school kids to get into Emory because we can afford to be more selective about whom we take. And so from my point of view as a teacher, it's very gratifying to work there because usually when I put a lot of work into preparing a class, the students are putting a lot of work in as well. And so I feel my time was well spent in getting it ready. Now, it was at Emory that the teaching company's recruiters came to visit me in the year 2000. And that was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. I made 6 courses with them. We got on very well with each other. And eventually, in the year 2009, they asked me to make a course on teaching, the one thing that all the other teaching company courses have in common. This course is designed to help people in a wide variety of teaching situations because we believe that the general principles of teaching are more or less exactly the same, whatever the format. Although you always have to adapt to the particulars of the circumstances you're in, the principles of good teaching remain more or less the same. Now, I recognized as soon as I was asked to do this course that in some ways my methods are idiosyncratic, especially because I'm a foreigner. My ideas about teaching still carry the imprint of my British origins, even though I've now spent more of my life in America than in Britain. So I said, we must talk to lots of other teachers as well, because there are lots of ways of doing it right. Let's gather up a variety of opinions, which will make the course that much more effective. That's what we did. We called up several of the teaching company's star teachers, and they let us interview them, film their classes, and then include film of those meetings in the finished product. This was in the fall of the year 2009. I travelled extensively with Marcy MacDonald, Kat Lyon and Tony Heidenreich of the teaching company to a variety of different campuses. They came to Emory, where I work, and we also went to Colorado and Duke and Louisville and Vanderbilt, Michigan and Bryant in Rhode Island. The people we interviewed are John Hale, a professor of archaeology at the University of Louisville; Jeanette Norden, a professor of neurobiology at the Vanderbilt Medical School; Stephen Nowicki, who's a professor of biology at Duke University and also the Dean of Undergraduate Education; Scott Page, a professor of complex systems at the University of Michigan; Stephen Pollock, a professor of physics at the University of Colorado; and Michael Roberto, professor of business at Bryant University in Rhode Island. All 6 of them are dedicated, and they're all teaching award winners with particular views on teaching and an unusual degree of self-awareness about how to do it. We also, in each campus, did student interviews. In many respects, it's the students who are the real experts on teaching, because once you become a qualified teacher, the chances are the only person whose class you'll enter is your own. But the students, if they're doing 4 or 5 classes per semester, means that over the course of a college degree, they've visited 20 or 30. And of course, they've got the recent memory of their high school teachers as well. They can do direct comparisons. They can see what's good and what's bad. And they develop a very acute idea of what they want their teachers to be like. And although sometimes they're tendentious in their views, on the whole, the things they kept saying were clearly the things which were entirely justified about how a teacher ought to be. So now this course has many new elements compared to teaching company standards. But as with all our courses, you'll learn a great deal from it. It's a course that's designed chiefly for actual practicing teachers, but also for anyone who's interested in teaching and anyone whose work sometimes requires them to teach informally. We'll introduce you to the principles relevant to a host of teaching situations, and as often as possible, we'll include illustrations of how to apply them in practice. Over the course of the next 23 lectures, we'll consider questions like these. How much material should I include in a 1-hour lecture? If I use PowerPoint to illustrate my lecture, are there any problems I need to be aware of in the use of it, of that and other new technologies? Suppose I'm holding a discussion class, a seminar, but the students won't participate. How do I get them to participate? Are there foolproof ways of getting them to join in? Are there foolproof ways of getting them to actually do the assigned reading? If I've got to grade students' work, or if I've got to evaluate students, how do I set about it? How exacting should I be when I'm working with students with writing problems? We're also going to take a look behind the scenes and to ask questions like these. Why do college teachers never get proper training? A point I already referred to. Why are college teachers never hired for reasons relating to their teaching ability? And I assure you that this is true. Even though the job is to teach college, you're not hired because of your good or bad teaching qualities. Why is there no connection between the breathtaking costs of higher education and the quality of teaching that students actually get in return for those high prices? And also more challenging questions like this. How does American faith in equality bump into the reality that teaching presupposes inequality and then exposes more inequalities as it goes along? Well, for 5 years, I was the director of Emory's Centre for Teaching and Curriculum. I'd always been eager to improve my teaching, and since college teachers tend not to have any formal training and to develop styles of their own ad hoc, I always used to go along to workshops at the CTC, the Centre for Teaching and Curriculum, and they would be on subjects like how to improve the quality of discussion classes. How do you work with students writing? How do you get them to be more attentive to questions of rhetoric and grammar and composition and structure? How do you keep authority in the classroom? How do you deal with the foreign students who've got a very, very good reading ability in English, but actually aren't capable of joining in the conversations fluently, or have cultural traditions which teach them that it's actually impolite to join in, even though that's exactly what you want them to be able to do? How do you deal with cheating and plagiarism, one of the most aggravating aspects of college life? Well, anyway, I went to all these workshops and was constantly learning from them and constantly exchanging ideas with other, mainly young teachers who'd got good ideas about how to do with it, or who were puzzled and recognized that they were puzzled. Anyway, I must have gone once too often, because eventually the dean of the college asked me to take over the directorship of the centre, which I then did for a very enjoyable 5-year term. I carried on running a wide array of workshops every week for faculty members and graduate student teaching assistants. But it also gave me the opportunity to watch a wide variety of my colleagues teaching. We had a confidential mentoring program whereby faculty members who wanted help could contact the centre and get a list of mentors and then speak with them confidentially to get them to visit their classes. I became one of these confidential mentors and would often go to other faculty members' classes, usually people who were struggling in some way, watch them teaching, and then give them advice on how they might overcome the problems they were encountering. I'll never forget one experience in this respect when I went to a Chinese language class. The entire class was taught in Chinese, and the result was that I didn't understand a single word spoken over the whole hour. And yet, I was able to see at once what the professor was doing well and what the professor was doing poorly, because the gestures, the requirements made of other students, the body language, the expectations of the students, all those came in clearly just through how people moved and how they spoke, even though I didn't know what they were saying. I also visited a music professor and was astonished by how much he could communicate just by waving his arms. This was a conducting class, and I've never had a more vivid impression of the power of non-verbal communication than I had watching him. The sheer act of moving up onto his toes caused the musicians to play in slightly different ways. And he had a vivid vocabulary of unspoken language, unspoken gestures. Nobody learned more from these events and experiences than I did, even though ostensibly I was the person dispensing advice. Another thing I did at the Centre for Teaching and Curriculum was to encourage and intensify its traditions of hospitality, catering events. Mainly it was a matter of working lunch times. I realised that if you offered everybody a free lunch, far more people would come. Sometimes people came because of the food, but then they started learning about how to be better teachers. And of course, it had the effect of making them feel more appreciated, because so many teachers at every level feel underappreciated. They feel as though they're being neglected. I always aim to make them feel good. As you'll see in these lectures, I've got strong ideas, some of which are out of fashion, and with which the other professors I'll be talking with quite often disagree. I mean, for example, I'm the only one among our group who said, the atmosphere in your classroom ought not to be comfortable. It ought to be a little bit tense. Now, the reason I say that is because my own experience, perhaps remembering those Oxford tutorials, is that I learned best when I was a little bit anxious. It made me alert, it kept me on the edge of my seat, and it made me really want to try hard. But virtually everybody I spoke with said, on this point, Dr. Allett, you're just wrong. Well, I'm happy to be contradicted, and this is one of the issues we'll talk about in some detail. See what you think about it. Over the course of these lectures, you'll follow me into my office, and you'll watch me consulting one-on-one with several students. And you'll follow me into my classroom as well. So you'll be able to see whether I practice what I preach. You probably know that many people think they do one thing, but actually they're doing something else altogether. Now, colleagues disagree often sharply on questions like whether it's appropriate to make a tense classroom atmosphere, whether it's appropriate to do cold calling, that is, suddenly calling on students by name to participate when they weren't expecting it. And they disagree about the degree to which you should and can have personal relationships with individual students. These are things we'll discuss as well. Now, I think it's pretty clear as soon as you start thinking about teaching that different subjects call for different approaches, as do teachers different ages and students different ages. It depends what stage you're at in your own career, whether you're starting out or whether you've been doing it for 30 years, as I have by now. It depends whether you're teaching in the liberal arts or vocationally. Two of our professors, Dr. Norden and Dr. Roberto, are professors of medicine and business, respectively. And their work leads directly to a practical way of life in the outside world. That's quite different than from the situation I'm in, or that John Hale, our archaeologist, is in. We're historians, and our teaching work has no immediate practical benefit. And of course that means that the teaching style has to differ commensurately. Well, despite our many differences, there were surprising similarities among all 7 of us about what we think makes a good teacher. We all share the view that teaching benefits from experience and that you ought to keep on getting better at it as your life continues. It's cumulative. Teaching is one of the essential activities of a civilized society. Every generation has to pass on the immense accumulated heritage of the past by teaching, sometimes in formal situations and sometimes informally. It starts with parents. Parents teach their children to walk, talk, dress, and develop manners. School teachers then take over. Usually they take over the more specialized activities like reading, writing, and arithmetic. Education's been expanding to take up more years for more people, especially in the advanced industrial nations over the course of the 20th century and into the 21st. And we're in the very unusual situation now of aiming at universal literacy. Throughout the history of the world, most people never could read and write. But now, America and Europe have showed that it's possible to introduce something pretty close to universal literacy, and India and China are catching up quickly. We also live in a world of intense specialization. That's inevitable in our world. It complicates the task and it makes the challenge of teaching well all the more difficult. I think all of us agreed in making this course that there are no shortcuts to complex knowledge. Our highly technologically sophisticated world needs specialists who sometimes have to train over a decade or more. That's particularly true of doctors, for example. We're also living in a world where innovation takes place very rapidly, and that creates immense educational challenges. Think about the way in which computers have developed since the 1960s and the need that implies for constant re-education just to keep up with the field. That leads us to recognize the importance of teaching students not just a body of knowledge, but also of how to think critically, how to learn how to learn, because we know that much of the particular knowledge we teach will become obsolete. We have to create lifelong learners, and that's going to be a major theme of this series. Now, think about yourself. You're probably like everyone else, which is to say that you're tempted by laziness. But everyone has the capacity to carry on learning. You've always got to struggle to open yourself to new ideas and be ready always to be a student again, be a student as well as a teacher. Think how often you procrastinate, but then think how gratifying it is when you don't. Let's go into my classroom on day 1 of my senior seminar where I raise this point exactly. There's a lot of readings each week, and obviously this is one of those classes where you can easily do all the work as long as you don't procrastinate. Now, which of you has ever procrastinated? All right. It's a constant temptation, isn't it? It feels great at the time, but then it just feels terrible later because then you have to do the work in a rush. In a way, that's the single most important lesson of all. If you can overcome the temptation to procrastinate and the temptation to be lazy, it's all going to work out. But there's many more things to it than just that. If you want to be a good teacher, think about the best teachers you had, the best teachers you've ever encountered, and what it was about them that inspired you, and then try to emulate those things. I asked the professors I interviewed to tell me about their best teachers, the ones who were particularly effective, helpful, and inspiring. And here's what some of them said.
The one who stands out the most was a graduate instructor, Dirk Walechka. He became my thesis advisor because he was such a wonderful teacher. I remember Remember the sense in his classroom that he loved his students and he wanted us to learn. Somebody told me about playing a game of softball in the physics picnic, and this professor was pitching the softball, and she said, it was just like in the class. He so wanted me to hit the ball.
Jeanette Norden can remember an even more committed teacher whose approach would seem excessive these days, but who clearly inspired her in a very good way.
I think one of the most influential people in my entire life was my 8th grade school teacher, Mrs. Rio Ware. And when I was in school, it was not uncommon for a student who was sort of the teacher's pet to go home with the teacher on the weekends, you know, to interact in that level with a teacher. I was this teacher's pet, and she would take me home on the weekends. And she taught me a lot about life. She taught me to be open-minded. She taught me about the joy of a life of the mind. No one in my family had ever gone to college. And so this was one of the first people I ever met and got to know who was an educated person. Her house was full of books. She was always trying to learn things. She had a marvelous view of the joy of learning in general, and she just played an incredible role in my life as a person on many levels.
I mentioned one of my own favourite teachers, my high school history teacher, Mr. Way, but also Kevin Sharp at Oxford University, a man who seemed very out of place, a Cockney rather than a man from the old British upper classes, but a very brilliant mind who made searching demands on me and my fellow students. My doctoral dissertation advisor, Richard Abrams, was also an incredibly exacting teacher who, when necessary, would tell me, you're simply not doing this work well enough, or you've got off on the wrong foot, or you're going down a blind alley. Working with him was sometimes difficult, but in the end, very, very gratifying, and I recognise a terrific debt of gratitude to him, which continues right up to the present. Now, every subject has its difficulties, and there's no use pretending that education is all fun. A lot of it's a grind. On the other hand, every subject does have its evangelists, and you've almost certainly encountered teachers who made you realise that the topic, which you previously thought of as just horrible, was at least potentially lovable. I often do this within the matter of dates. It's so common to meet people who say, I like history, but I hate learning the dates. So I often focus in on the dates and say, aren't these dates lovely? Darn, they're so beautiful. Just 4 digits, they're so compressed. They've got the kind of beautiful compression of diamonds. You know, I'll put a slide up on the board and I'll say, now here's a picture taken in 1875. Look at the 1875-ishness of it. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that all students suddenly start loving dates, but it does make them think, oh, I remember him. He was the guy who actually liked dates. It raises in their minds the possibility that they might be lovable. My best teachers all somehow prompted in me the idea that I should please them by living up to their expectations. And I certainly now try to induce the same feeling in my own students today. You gradually develop a sense of how to work on the students' minds so that they want to gratify you. Of course, this is a kind of psychological manipulation, but it's a benevolent one because the outcome is to improve their learning. Oh, and incidentally, they're trying to manipulate us as well, so we're doing it to each other. Sometimes you encounter cases of hero worship. It can be very useful if you know how to turn it to your advantage, and that's another point I'll be talking about a bit later on. To be a good teacher, you've got to be willing to be self-critical. You've got to criticise yourself and work at self-improvement. Listen now to Professor Stephen Nowicki at Duke University describing the pain and the necessity of studying film of himself as he works on his own teaching. Have you sometimes studied yourself on film as a way of developing your gestures?
Yes. In fact, as a graduate student, I was given the opportunity to be filmed as part of a teacher training course. And it was extraordinarily painful and extraordinarily useful. And I have gotten the opportunity to have myself filmed, including a course for the teaching company, where it's always very educational to see yourself on film and to look very squarely at it and ask yourself, what are you doing that's effective? I tend to put a lot of energy into lectures, but I learned early on that you can dance around stage too much. You know, it can be distracting. And the point is to find out what's distracting and to focus on what you think helps deliver the message.
It often takes a long time to realise whether you're teaching effectively. It's possible to be impressive, even theatrical, but not memorable. You need to learn how to teach so that your students will remember your most important points, ideally years later. You need to learn to think before a course even begins, what you want the students to know by the time it's ended. You need to ask yourself questions like this. What do I want these students to remember from this course 5 years from now? What are the most important things? That'll have a clarifying effect because it'll help you to worry less about the fine details and more about the really important issues. Let me sum up. Whatever your teaching situation is, school, college, as a coach, as a parent, or as an employer, we offer this course to help you improve, and we hope to inspire you to teach better, more effectively, and with greater self-awareness. If you can stay with us, you'll spend the next 23 lectures in the company of 7 workaholics who've devoted their entire adult lives to teaching and closely related work. Yes, we're obsessive personalities. But I do think that among us we've unlocked some of the secrets of turning teaching from a functional and business-like activity into something approaching an art, hence our title. You've probably heard of the concept of runner's high, when the monotony and pain of jogging, if carried on for long enough, suddenly unlocks a new compartment in your body and turns the motion into a wonderful and unexpected pleasure. I've experienced teacher's high, often in my career, sometimes with undergraduates, sometimes with groups of senior citizens, and perhaps most often when teaching my own daughter to read, write, count, and kick a soccer ball. With a bit of luck, I'll introduce you to the same sensation. Now let's go on from here. In the next lecture, I'm going to be talking about the broad range of learners and the way we need to come to terms with them.